Hello everyone, and welcome to this new edition of Euroquestions, the bi-monthly webinar of the Jacques Delors Institute. Today we have the pleasure to welcome Eulalia Rubio, senior researcher at the Jacques Delors Institute and one of the co-authors of the study Adapting the EU Budget to Make it Fit for the Purpose of Future Enlargements, commissioned by the European Parliament's Committee on Budgets. A persistent idea in the European debate is that new accessions to the Union, particularly poorer countries, have a significant negative impact on the EU budget. The recent study review adjustments made by the EU budget during the past enlargements and estimate the budgetary cost of the accession of all the current candidate and potential candidate countries, excluding Turkey, under a different scenario. It then provided policy recommendation for adapting the next MFF to future enlargements, emphasized the need for a credible commitment to pre-accession support, the importance of addressing the statistical effect on the cohesion policy allocation, and the challenges posed by Ukraine accession, particularly in the relation to the common agricultural policy. So what are the implications for Ukraine to joining the EU? Will the EU budget be significantly affected by new member states? I remind you that you can use the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. Eulalia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Lara. Thank you, everyone. So I am going to present the findings of this study that we have done for the European Parliament. Maybe we can pass the slide that shows the study, Laura. Yeah. And therefore, this is a study that we have done. We were a research team of 7 people, and the objective of the study was to analyze the implications of future enlargements for the next MFF. And to do so, what we did, among other things, was to estimate the budgetary cost of enlargement under 3 different scenarios. These scenarios were not realistic scenarios, were taken for methodological purposes. The first scenario was a gradual integration, in which we assume no accessions taking place before 2034, but the EU maintaining this commitment to enlargement in form of pre-accession support. The second scenario was a small bank, what we call a small bank scenario, in which we assume that all 6 Western Balkan countries would join the Union in 2030. And our big bank scenario was under the assumption that the 6 Western Balkans plus Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova would accept the Union by 2030. And then based on these estimations, but also based on lessons drawn from past enlargements, we formulate some recommendations for the preparation of the next MFF. Now, I'm not going to present all the study, all the findings, because it's a very long study with a lot of information. What I want to do with this short time is maybe to pass 4 or 5 key messages that I think are important to frame the discussion about the budgetary cost of enlargement, which are based, the messages, on our findings, but also on findings from our other studies or other literature that has discussed this issue. Next slide, please. So the first message, which is a very important message, I believe, is that estimating the budgetary cost of enlargements is challenging. It is not something easy. How do we estimate this budgetary cost? Actually, what we do and what other scholars have done is that we look at the 2 main areas in which spending is pre-allocated among member states, cohesion policy and CAP, and we look at the eligibility rules, and we look how these funds are allocated among member states on the basis of which rules, and we try to apply the same rules to the candidates, the potential candidates, and therefore we extrapolate, we estimate how much transfers of cohesion CAP funds these countries would receive. Now, the problem is that for cohesion policy, this is relatively easy to be done because we have a numerical formula to distribute the funds across member states, mainly based on GDP per capita and population. But this is not the same for CAP funds. CAP funds, the CAP national allocation, stemmed from historical decisions that were taken a long time ago, linked to the agricultural production of member states. Of course, there is a loose relationship between the extension of agricultural land of one country and how much funds they receive from CAP, but the CAP 8 intensity, the funds per hectare, are very different from one member state or the other, and no, they do not correspond to objective criteria. So it's very difficult to extrapolate this to new member states. And the same for non-allocated spending. We don't have a clear rule to know how much non-allocated spending has to increase in case of enlargements. So therefore, when we do estimates, we have to take some proxies and to take some policy assumptions. And that's why there is a bit of variance with the budgetary cost, with the studies that exist. That's the first message. That's difficult to do. Second message, maybe the second slide, please, is that history shows that accessions do not necessarily result into higher EU budgets. That's also a deep root idea. I mean, Lara, you mentioned this, no? That people tend to think that when there is an enlargement, that will immediately, automatically result into higher EU budgets. But actually, when you look at the past, that happened in the first waves of enlargements. There was an increase in the EU budget, but since the 2000s, actually, the budget has been more or less stable at 1% of EU GNI. So the budget has not increased in relative terms. Even if we have had other accessions, we had the Eastern European accession in 2004. And even if we look at the composition of the EU budget, it's difficult to find a common pattern. The Iberian enlargement of the 80s led to an increase of EU cohesion funds in relative terms, so the expenditure increased in the EU budget, but that was not the case for the Eastern European enlargement. It did not increase cohesion funds after the Eastern European enlargement. And if we look at CAP, what we have seen over the time is that the CAP, the share of CAP in the EU budget has decreased since the 80s. So the enlargements have not produced an increase in terms of CAP expenditure. Next slide, please. Message to pass when we talk about the impact of enlargement in the next MFF is that enlargement, it's not likely to dominate the next MFF negotiations. We have to be clear about that. Why so? Well, first, because there are many challenges that are already affecting these MFF negotiations. We know that there are the NGU costs to be repaid. There are a lot of pressures to increase other items like defense, security. Second, because there all seems to indicate that according to the level of readiness of current candidate and potential candidate countries, all seems to indicate that most of them will not enter the Union before 2034, with the exception perhaps of one or two small Western Balkans. And it's not me that says this, even the Commissioner Marta Kroes said that that was the expectations from the Commission. So the impact for the EU budget, if this is what happens, it will be very minimal. The accession of, we calculate in our study, for instance, the cost of the accession of Montenegro, and it will be equivalent to 1.17 billion per year. So it's really very, very small. And actually this can be easily accommodated through margins or redeployment. So you don't need to have a specific reserve if this is the accessions that we will have. So the main focus in the next MFF should be, and it will probably be, how to support the accession efforts. I mean, how much support we have to give to candidates, which type of support, whether it's in form of only investments or investments and reforms, and also support to Ukraine, no matter what happens with the membership status. We will probably need a massive support for post-war reconstruction. We do some discussions or some recommendations on that in the study also. But apart from that, even if we don't expect big accessions to take place in the next MFF, it's true that we see that there is already a pervasive narrative about the supposed extraordinary cost of enlargement. So it's important to start putting some clarity to that, but because there have been already some studies done, and some people already come with statements saying that it will be unaffordable for the Union, this enlargement. So I think it's important to come with figures and also to contextualize these figures and explain that this is just the net budgetary cost of enlargements, but of course they have to put into context with other benefits, economic and security benefits of enlargement. Next slide, please. And fourth message maybe is that's more specific and that goes more to the findings of our study. So as I said, estimating the budgetary cost it's difficult, and basically what we do is to apply current eligibility rules on cohesion and CAP, which are the two main items that are likely to be under pressure when there is an accession of poorer member states. But if we apply current rules, it's also very important to understand that accessions create different challenges for cohesion than for CAP. If we look at cohesion, the first thing to notice is that new accessions in principle do not have to significantly increase the cohesion policy budget. And why it is so? It's because in the cohesion policy rules, we have what we call an automatic capping mechanism that imposes that transfers to any country cannot be superior to 2.3% of national GDP. And that means that no matter how big it is the country, it will only receive 2.3% at maximum of its GDP. So that's an automatic limit to the increase in cohesion policy budgets. However, accessions of current countries create what we call the problem of a statistical effect. And what's this? Actually, what we have in cohesion policy is that what one country receives in cohesion policy funds is very much related to its GDP per capita with respect to the EU average. So countries are classified, and regions basically are classified according to the GDP per capita with respect to the EU average as less developed, more developed transition regions, and they receive much more funds according to the eligibility category in which they are. So when there are poorer countries entering to the EU, that diminishes actually the EU average, and that creates what we call the statistical effect, that without doing anything, let's say regions and countries can be upgraded to a higher eligibility category and therefore receiving less funds. This is something that happened in past enlargements, so we know this effect. So our study of course, analyze this statistical effect, and what we find is that it can be important. It will be target. It will not affect many member states, but it can be significant. And in our case, for instance, in our scenarios, we find that 2 member states in the small bank scenario and 6 member states in the big bank scenario would receive between 16 and 21% less CP funds in case of accessions compared to a scenario of non-enlargement in the next MFF. And third important point also that sometimes is not put into advance is that this automatic rule that I was mentioning also has another non-intended effect, let's say, that it results in very limited support to new, very poor member states. So candidates and potential candidates are countries that have very low GDP levels, and therefore if you apply this cap of 2.3% GDP, you give them not a lot of funds actually. What we find in our study, for instance, it is very illustrative, is that new member states applying this rule would receive lower cohesion per capita allocations than current member states, even the poorer among the current member states, which are 13 member states that joined the Union after 2004. So that also opens the question of whether we have to keep this 2.3% rule for new member states, or maybe increase to 4%, as it was the case some years ago. It's not something that has always existed. So let's pass to the last slide on this 4th point, which is on CAP. What happens on CAP? On CAP is totally different, actually. First, we do not have an automatic capping rule that caps the amount of funds a country can receive. And therefore, we do not cap in advance the overall budget of CAP. We have the risk of, let's say, exploding the cap budget if no upper ceiling is imposed. And actually, there are some studies that have estimated the cost of the impact of Ukraine's accession on CAP, and they estimate that the CAP budget could increase between 22 and 25% if there is no upper ceiling imposed, and if we grant to Ukraine a similar treatment in terms of funds per hectare than current member states. So the second question is, as I said, there is no rule to determine how much funds per hectare a country has to receive from CAP. So we would need to decide how much CAP aid intensity we have to give to new member states. In case they are granted the same CAP intensity than all member states, and even in case that we gave them the CAP intensity of those member states that receive less funds per hectare, which are the Eastern European countries today, and if we decide that, if we imagine that we decide that CAP budget will be kept at today's level in real terms, these are the assumptions, by the way, that we take in our scenarios. Our conclusion is that current member states must accept cuts in their CAP national allocations to respect this upper ceiling in CAP budget. So actually, to be more precise, in our study, we take these assumptions. CAP Pillar 1 budget will be maintained in real terms. And we take the assumptions that new member states will be granted equivalent CAP funds per hectare than post-2004 member states. And under these assumptions, actually the EU27 cap national allocations would have to be reduced on average by 15% in the big bang scenario. That's a big cut, actually. Now, of course, there are alternatives, there are solutions to try to mitigate this cut, and there are solutions that have already been used in past enlargements. An obvious solution is to impose a transitional phasing period so that new member states do not immediately have access to cap. They have access progressively during a 10-year period, for instance. And another solution that was also used in complement to this one in the last enlargement is to offer new member states less advantageous access to cap, actually, so less cap funds per hectare. The problem is that these two solutions are not bad in itself, and probably they will be used, but they have problems. They are not optimal. The first one is transitionary, so it does not resolve the problem in the long term. And the second one, somehow it is also not sustainable, actually, because what we know from past enlargements is that once candidates enter and become member states, they use the leverage power, the negotiating power, to improve the situation. They do not accept to be treated differently. And actually, in the current cap budget, we have this problem of Eastern European countries receiving a bit less cap funds per hectare, and they have succeeded to create a processes of convergence in cap 8 intensities. So it is not something that can be permanent, actually. So these are the 4 messages I wanted to pass. And then the last slide, maybe just very short, because I want to give some time for questions, the policy recommendations. So I will just list them a bit. No? As I said, I mean, the first policy recommendation was about pre-accession support. That will be the key issue for the next MFF, not the cost of enlargements. And basically, the message we wanted to pass is a message of credibility, that we have to put enough funds, enough support to keep these countries in the membership path, so motivated to do the efforts. And also we did some recommendations on how to improve the way of providing this support. We believe that we have to adapt this facility approach, so combine investments and reforms, as it has been done for Ukraine and for the Western Balkans, and to extend this to other candidates. Second point is the question of post-war reconstruction. We know that there will be massive cost on that, and the question mark is which role the EU budget will have to play here. Of course, the EU budget cannot cover all these post-war reconstruction costs, and has to be covered by an alliance of international donors. But the question is which role how the EU budget will be involved in this support. Third point is the need for a clear communication by the Commission communication strategy on how to explain the cost and benefits of enlargement. So the danger of talking about budgetary cost of enlargements is that people focus on that, and they do not take into account other benefits of enlargement. So it's very important to be clear, to explain where these numbers come from, and also to combine them with other numbers showing the benefits of enlargement. Fourth point is the need to anticipate cohesion and cap impacts or impacts of accession on these two policies. With different options to mitigate the cost. And finally, and I do not have the time to elaborate, on procedural aspects, what we say is that we have to plan for various possible enlargement scenarios. So probably there will only be smaller scenarios that we can cover with margins, but there is also the possibility that there is a big bang scenario we can never exclude. And if this possibility becomes more realistic before adopting the new MFF, maybe we have to think about creating some reserves to quickly react to this scenario. So I stop here for the questions and answers, Lara.
Thank you very much, Eulalia, for your presentation. So maybe a first question, you mentioned it at the beginning of your presentation. How does the study suggest handling the statistical effect on current member state cohesion allocation due to the accession of poor countries?
Yeah, this is not something new, actually. As I said in previous enlargements, we had already had this statistical effect. So I think the Commission knows very well how to handle this problem. And there has been always solutions, such as, for instance, allowing these countries or regions that are affected by the statistical effect to keep the eligibility category they had for a certain period in a temporary solution or giving them additional funds targeting those that are affected by a statistical effect. So this is not a real issue, actually. The real issue is to identify which ones will be affected by this statistical effect. Let me also add that we only point, I mean, in the presentation, I only point out the statistical effect, but there might also be demands to compensate for other countries which are affected by enlargement, not through the statistical effect, but for instance, countries that are bordering the accession countries, or countries that was productive activities very much linked to the productive activity of these countries, and that might have negative effects through value change connections. So as we did for Brexit, that we create a specific instrument to support those economies that were harmed by the exit of the United Kingdom, there might be also ad hoc instruments to compensate for specific economies, regional or national economies that are negatively affected by the accession.
Thank you, Eulalia. Maybe a second question. What are the proposed measures to ensure the credibility of pre-accession support for candidate country? You mentioned it in your recommendation.
Yeah, what we say is that, I mean, no, what we have done an important, I mean, the Union has done an important improvement. It has significantly improved the support given to, of course, Ukraine with the Ukraine facility, but also to the Western Balkans, actually, with the Western Balkan facility that was adopted in 2024. It has been increased the percentage of support quite significantly. And what we believe is that we should guarantee the same amount of support to all candidates so that we do not create differences in treatments, but of course, all the support has to be conditioned to reforms. I mean, and this is also a message that we want to pass, that even if we reserve an important amount of support for pre-accession, not all the support necessarily will be disbursed, because this is conditioned always to reform. I'm thinking, for instance, in cases such as Georgia, that today it's not in a good path to our membership. I mean, the fact of proposing a facility does not mean that all money will be disbursed, actually, if the country does not pass the necessary reforms and does not change the fundamentals in terms of rule of law or democracy. Of course, this money will not be disbursed. And in this sense, also, we do a lot of recommendations on how to improve the governance of these facilities. One of the things that we say is that there is a high risk of politicization in the way of disbursing these funds, because, of course, in enlargement, there is a lot of geopolitical pressures in the context. So we propose some mechanisms to give more transparency and to ensure that disbursements are really related to reform progress of these member states.
Thank you.
And maybe if I can add a last point, we also say that not all support to this context has to be conditioned to reform of central governments, because we also have to support the populations. We also have to support the civil society. We also have to support the growth of these economies. And maybe it makes sense not to condition everything to the efforts of the central governments if we want to create, a pro-European support in the whole country.
Yes, thank you. Maybe a follow-up question on that. What amounts are allocated by the instrument for pre-accession assistance for candidate country, and how does this future fund used?
Sorry, repeat the question. How many?
What amounts are allocated by the instrument of assistance for candidate country, and how are these funds used?
Yeah, actually, I don't have the figures in my head, but what I can say is that today, today we have a very strange situation, because we have some candidates that are under IPA, this instrument for pre-accession, which is the all pre-accession support, let's say, and some candidates that benefits from these facilities, which are Ukraine and the Western Balkans, and now Moldova also, as there is a process to create a facility for Moldova. What is clear is that the ones that benefit from a facility, they receive much more funds on annual terms than the ones that do not benefit from a facility. So IPA is in annual terms is not as much as the facilities. At the same time, IPA is not clearly related to reforms efforts. And we have some situations that are a bit strange, because IPA, for instance, the first beneficiary of IPA today is Turkey. It's not a country that is doing a lot of efforts towards the membership. So the facility is not only bigger amounts of budget, but it's also using the budget in a more strategic way, because you have more capacity to reward the ones that really do efforts to go closer to membership.
Thank you. We receive another question. You mentioned one of the lack of an upper ceiling on the common agriculture policy compared to the CP. Do you think that the current enlargement fear circulating in countries that is heavily related to the common agriculture policy like Ireland is justified?
Sorry, repeat again, Lara. I don't remember. I don't understand the question actually.
Yeah, in your presentation, you mentioned that there is quite a fear among the member states, the current member states, the common agricultural policy. So do you think this is justified? For example, like Ireland, that they they see a new accession, like Ukraine is a big
No, I see. I understand. Look, the question of CAP is difficult. I mean, CAP, the entrance of Ukraine requires a radical rethinking on CAP, and there is no easy solution. I think that's the message to pass, because for Dutch people, the increase of CAP is seen as an anathema, something really bad, negative, that will be very difficult to convince people from enlargement. If you talk to French people, saying that CAP national allocations have to decrease by 15% is also very bad, actually. And it's very bad for the debate to convince public opinions on the benefits of enlargement. So no one is really satisfied. It's very difficult. And we have to be, that's why we say one of the messages we have to anticipate this. We have to list the possible options to mitigate or to accommodate to these disruptions and to take the best ones. And actually there are different combinations, and it's not either or. You can do something, a compromise. You can do phasing transitional periods, plus providing first access to CAP on less advantageous terms, plus maybe some efforts to reduce or maintain CAP budget without reducing a lot CAP national allocation. So you can find a compromise by maybe mixing up different types of options. But there is no, I mean, the only non-option is no change, actually, because no change is not possible. It's simply not possible.
Thank you. Maybe a follow-up question on Ukraine. Ukraine potential accession to the European Union could have a significant impact between 120 billion to 136 billion euros on the Union MFF, according to a study by Bruegel last year. Do you think that this figure are credible and not discouraging a European Union public opinion?
No, they are totally, I mean, I know that they are totally credible. The figures depend on what type of assumptions you take, and all assumptions are credible or are justifiable. They are policy assumptions. In the case of Bruegel, they took the assumption of not capping CAP budget, actually, and that's the difference with our study. And it gives you the idea what will happen if you don't put a cap on CAP budget. Of course, if member states maintain the same allocations they have on CAP and provide more or less equivalent CAP aid intensity to new member states, to Ukraine in this case, the solution is a big bill actually to pay. That's the fact. So it's not bad or right or bad the study. It's just different policy assumptions that have been adopted to do the figures actually.
Thank you. And maybe one last question, considering also the recent communication quote the road to the next multilateral financial framework, how can the future pre-accession support for Western Balkans be better aligned with the new cohesion policy?
Well, that's a big difficult. I think one question that we do not mention maybe enough in our study, I must say that the study covered a lot of things. So we had to cover also pre-accession support in detail, the design of the pre-accession support. We had to cover the estimation, the budgetary cost. But one issue that it's not really covered in our study is this question of to which extent pre-accession support should help candidate countries learn how to use cohesion funds. And it's true that until now, pre-accession support has not been really very much aligned to the way of using cohesion policy funds. I mean, there were two different ways of disbursing money, actually. So the countries that were receiving this money, they were not learning by receiving this money and using this money how to implement cohesion funds. Now, in the future, the fact of using facility approach, actually, one of the positive side effects of that is that if we also use a more performance-based approach in cohesion policy, as it seems to be the vision of the Commission, then we are aligning a bit the way of using the funds actually, because we will use performance-based approach in the facilities, and we will use also performance-based approach in these new plans, which will cover also cohesion funds. So one positive side effect of that is that indirectly we are aligning the way of using funds. So we are allowing candidate countries to learn also how to use the funds that later on they will use inside being members of the EU.
Thank you very much, Eulalia, for your presentation, and thank you to everyone for following Studio Euroquestion. We will send the replay over to you this afternoon. The next session will be held on Wednesday, 26 February, and we will have the pleasure to welcome Jan Bernet, Policy Fellow at the Jacques Soller Center in Berlin, and he will analyze the result of the German election and its implication to the European Union. Thanks again, Eulalia, and thank you, everyone. Have a nice afternoon.